Welcome to Passionate Reply and welcome to Great Albums. Today I'll be talking about a stellar album by one of those artists who have gone down in history as one-hit wonders, despite producing a deep catalog that's often more impressive than that one song they end up known for. It's the golden age of wireless, the debut LP of Thomas Dolby. Chances are pretty good you've heard his big hit, She Blinded Me with Science, before, at least if you're American. Like I said, if you're American, you've heard this one before. If anything, it's oversaturated. But if you're from elsewhere in the world, you might not know it. Growing up in the US, I went through the whole gauntlet of alleged one-hit wonders of 80s synth pop, and a great many of them turned out to be British artists who had perfectly respectable careers in their native UK. Gary Newman, Soft Cell, and OMD, for example. Thomas Dolby is also British, but he's apparently more famous here than he is across the pond. Which is not that famous. He really ought to be, though, because the golden age of wireless is a true masterpiece. Or at least it was in its original form. It's actually a tough album to talk about insofar as it's hard to pin down what exactly constitutes the golden age of wireless. It's had quite a few different pressings and a variety of different track listings, and the original version of it does not include She Blinded Me with Science. While I'd never argue that it's a bad song, since it is insanely fun and catchy to the point of being irresistible, it really does not belong on this album. I'm sure it helped them move copies of it, but its inclusion kind of ruins the vibe, to be honest. Its in-your-face and flamboyant hooks make it feel like a very unwarranted intrusion on an otherwise fairly serious and contemplative LP, which seems to have been intended as a fairly tight and thoughtful concept album. Aside from that glaring issue, there are a few other tracks that have appeared on later versions of the album that weren't there from the start, namely the two tracks from Dolby's first ever release, a double A-side of Urges and Leipzig, as well as One of Our Submarines, the B-side of some versions of She Blinded Me with Science. All of these tracks are excellent and mesh with the thematic and sonic character of the album quite well. One of Our Submarines, in particular, is often considered one of the best tracks of Dolby's career. Melancholy, claustrophobic, and stinging in its poignant sense of tragedy. It captures the misery and futility of modern war, as well as the sunset of the British Empire after the Second World War, and there's a sample of a dolphin, too. It's easily the track that I most wish had been included from the very start. Now that that's over with, I'd like to drill down and talk about how the album operates in its original form as the artist intended. Like I said earlier, the golden age of wireless is best understood as a concept album, and I think of it in a similar league as classics like the Buggles' The Age of Plastic, OMD's Dazzle Ships, or even Kate Bush's Hounds of Love. The original track listing opens with Flying North, a stellar introduction to one of the most prominent themes of the album: freedom.
Floor of a Pan Am bar, I'm staring right into the light and I'm drawn in like a moth, and I'm flying north again. Here comes
Flying North is an exultant anthem of self-determination, and one clearly mediated by metal birds. Airplanes, that is. It's a celebration of the independence allowed by technology, and a rather winsome one in which this almost macho image of a heroic pilot takes center stage. The final track of the album, Cloudburst at Shingle Street, is a bit more esoteric, but seems to be aiming for a pretty similar idea overall, and I'd argue that the two of them form thematic bookends.
Then take this vest of plastic, these boots of concrete, and marking down her surplus, return to Albury.
Cloudburst at Shingle Street leads us through the technological evolution of mankind, from swinging from trees to paving concrete beaches, but the spacey synth warbles beneath those lines give them an ominous bent. The assertion that we might be heading into a cloudburst, mindless, naked, or blindly, is unnervingly cynical, but we're told there's no escaping it. Despite all of these signs that our better judgment should be resisting the temptation of this miraculous cloudburst, this triumphant rising coda, with its powerful choir encouraging us onwards, seems to muddle the whole thing. The untethered, free-roaming nature of modern life isn't always this sexy and exuberant, though. Consider the track Weightless as a counterpoint.
Some nights he's weightless, he has to travel, his mouth is gravel, and there's an empty feeling within his heart. Eye on the fuel gauge, Westchester Thruway, that triple octane won't contain the empty feeling in Dolby's heart. Same old insecurity, strap him into his car seat, and some started leaking all over New Jersey. Gas stations everywhere, not one drop to fill me.
Weightless certainly seems to be about modern transients of some sort, in this case traveling by car, but never lionizes them or makes them too terribly enviable. Instead, the focus is on the image of the draining fuel tank, the constant emptiness and craving for meaning, validation, and genuine love. No matter the allure of this very American Route 66-like setting, the gas stations, cinemas, and decadent diner meals along the way are never any real substitute for an emotionally authentic life. That setting is, of course, a wistfully backward-looking mid-century one. Nostalgia and childhood naivete are also among the album's major themes, and are expressed most clearly on Europa and the Pirate Twins.
Pictures on my windowsill, but that's not quite the same. It isn't, is it? Europa, my old friend, will be the pirate twins again. Europa, oh my country, Europa. I'll walk beside you in the rain. Europa, pirate would be.
Narratively, Europa and the Pirate Twins is a bittersweet story of childhood playmates who never quite reunite despite promising to be together again someday. The really interesting wrinkle is the fact that the narrator's beloved Europa has become a famous celebrity as an adult, and the narrator is essentially a fan of her despite their real-world relationship. It's an uncanny, confused, parasocial relationship dynamic that feels extremely contemporary, despite the fact that it's ultimately more of a commentary on the rise of teenager-oriented marketing during the mid-century than anything else. The strange, often unhealthy relationships between young people and mass media, particularly radio, are another one of the major sources of tension on the golden age of wireless. Europa and the Pirate Twins is also one of the more interesting tracks instrumentally, featuring a prominent harmonica part performed by Andy Partridge of XTC. Given how much the album strives to be about the future and past simultaneously, steeped in nostalgia and utopian visions alike, it makes sense to hear Dolby blend elements of traditional folk or popular music with forward-thinking synth-pop sensibilities. Listen also for a flute on Wind Power and a substantial amount of guitar on Commercial Breakup, a song that proves Dolby certainly can rock if he feels like it. Art for the golden age of wireless isn't exactly the most iconic, but I've always thought it was very beautiful. You've got this very eye-catching, lurid pulp magazine-style illustration of Dolby as a diligent yet glamorous engineer, radiating with a complementary color palette of orange and blue, the perfect picture of retro cool. But it's framed and inset to give us a conscious sense of observing something that's coming to us from another time, an artifact, preserved. That patina and sense of the antique is amplified by this dull-colored background, which actually shows a marble sculpture gallery in a museum, though that's tough to make out unless you have it right in front of you. The numerous shades of irony operating here are another thing that makes the album feel strikingly contemporary. I'm also a huge fan of the album's title, Wireless, if you weren't aware, is an old-fashioned term for radio. Radio itself is a strong theme on the album, most obviously on the track Radio Silence, but the use of the term wireless isn't just another piece of retro nostalgia. I think it's also evocative of that sense of free-flying, untethered independence I talked about earlier. The first half, i.e. Golden Age, is perhaps even more important. Golden Age is an extremely loaded term that brings a number of rich associations to the table. Golden Ages are simultaneously longed for but not fully believed in. They're bygone eras that usually felt like nothing special to the people who actually lived through them, despite their greatness being palpable to anyone reflecting on them in hindsight. In every Golden Age, there's a poetic tragedy. I think that even if someone did buy this record just to get their hands on She Blinded Me with Science, they'd probably be at least a little bit disappointed in what they got. The album does have some decent pop singles, chiefly Radio Silence in Europa and the Pirate Twins, but they're still humming with nostalgia and unease, and not without some substantial experimental DNA. The single weirdest track on the album, The Wreck of the Fairchild, they still retain some fairly ambitious tracks, such as Wind Power, clearly an ode to Kraftwerk's radioactivity. It's hard to be angry with an electronic musician for trying to rip off Kraftwerk, since they all do it one way or another, and in this case, it invites a natural comparison between two great concept albums focused on this theme of radio. Overall, though, the Golden Age of Wireless is still a reasonably accessible album on the whole. Possibly not what you expected, and certainly a work that's more sentimental and affecting than good for the dance floor, but as far as poignant ballady diesel punk goes to the tragic techno-optimism of the mid-century go, I'd say it's not all that hard to get into. Dolby does have a pop core as an artist that he's quite capable of selling to us if he chooses to. For proof of that point, look no further than the single Hyperactive, which he followed this up with a few years later.
At the tender age of 3, I was hooked to a machine just to keep my mouth from spouting junk. Ha! It must have took me for a fool, cause they chucked me out of school, cause the teacher knew I had the funk. But tonight I'm on the edge, you better shut me in the fridge, because I'm burning up, I'm burning up. With the vision in my brain, and the music in my veins, and the dirty rhythm in my blood, they are messing with my heart, and they're messing with my heart, and they're messing with my heart. Won't stop messing with my, ripping me apart.
discussing an ostensible one-hit wonder, there's a distinct temptation to resort to "they deserved better" style rhetoric. On one hand, yes, I do think more people should hear Thomas Dolby's music, and that it has a lot to say to us. I'm all about obscure music finding new life and being appreciated. That said, in the case of Dolby, I think he basically got what he wanted in the end. He's always been more keenly interested in music's many behind-the-scenes roles than he has in chasing pop stardom himself. He's produced music and scored a number of films and video games over the decades. It feels kind of wrong to tell someone who's successful at one thing that they deserve to be successful at something different, just because we may want to hear him do it or because we esteem one skill set more highly than the other. Ultimately, the Golden Age of Wireless is a great album on its own terms. Whether Dolby ever decides to grace us with another synth-pop release under his own name again, which he did in 2011 with A Map of the Floating City. But it's his decision as an artist, and the fact that he can choose to or not is a luxury that allows him integrity. I think that's the way it ought to be. The overall top track on this album has gotta be Airwaves, a song in which the narrator dies, tragically and suddenly, in an automobile accident. It's not the sexy, warm leatherette sort of car accident, but rather a dismally realistic one that shows, quite frankly, how undignified death can be. Sometimes we aren't so much doomed heroes as we are frightened, sickly children defeated by our own fickle bodies. The last thought our narrator gets is, "I itch all over, let me sleep." Their honor perishes just moments before they do. Meanwhile, the Regio is a constant presence throughout and serves as both something to anchor the scene in the droll and quotidian, as well as ultimately becoming something transcendent. The promise of Airwaves is not only the human interconnectedness made possible by technology, but also a hint at the ultimate destiny of human souls, a kind of ethereal afterlife in the sky. The meandering lulls of the verses contrast sharply with the song's eerily soaring refrain, which enhances that feeling that those airwaves occupy some sort of higher plane. On that surprisingly heavy note, that is all I've got for today, so thanks for listening!
Strange how the scale forms in tiny patterns on my antenna and the 5 o'clock sharp alarm. Brooklyn is crawling with famous people. I turn my vehicle beneath the river west from south. Through the airwaves, people never read the airwaves. Do we only feed the airwaves? I really should have